For most of history, human beings have mistaken visibility for importance and survival for meaning. When early humans looked at the sky, they assumed the stars revolved for their benefit. When they looked at the Earth, they treated it as a stage prepared in advance for their arrival. This was not arrogance in the modern sense, but a primitive misunderstanding born from fear and limited perspective. Civilizations grew around this misunderstanding. Empires rose with the quiet certainty that their power was permanent, their values universal, and their presence necessary. Rome believed itself eternal until it became a memory studied in ruins. Medieval Europe believed divine order guaranteed moral superiority until plague reduced prayer and crown alike to the same silence. Each era thought it had finally understood the world, and each era collapsed under the weight of that confidence. The uncomfortable truth is that history does not reward self-importance. It exposes it. From ancient rulers who declared themselves gods to modern ideologies that promised final answers, the pattern remains unchanged. When humans confuse dominance with destiny, reality eventually corrects the error without negotiation or apology. Biology offers no comfort here. You are not designed for truth, fulfillment, or greatness. You are designed to persist long enough to reproduce. Consciousness did not arrive as a gift of meaning, but as a tool for navigation, threat detection, and social positioning. The stories you tell yourself about purpose came later, stitched together to make existence more tolerable. Philosophers noticed this long before neuroscience could measure it. Schopenhauer understood that what we call will is not freedom but compulsion, and that our sense of control is often little more than a narrative layered on instinct. Nietzsche observed that humanity does not seek truth as much as it seeks comfort, and that most moral systems are attempts to disguise weakness as virtue. Seen from this distance, the human being is not a miracle, but a pattern, repeated endlessly across time with minor variations in language, technology, and clothing. The same fears, the same ambitions, the same hunger for significance appear in every century, wearing different names and symbols. History is not a story of progress toward wisdom, but a record of how often confidence outruns understanding. This is not an attack on humanity, and it is certainly not a call for despair. It is an invitation to step outside the inflated image you inherited and look at yourself without mythology. Because only when the illusion of importance collapses does responsibility begin. And only when the fantasy of being special fades does the possibility of becoming disciplined, lucid, and useful quietly emerge. When human beings begin to believe they are exceptional by nature, they stop examining their behavior and start defending their identity. This is the precise moment where growth slows and repetition begins. History shows this pattern with uncomfortable consistency, because self-importance is not merely a personal flaw, but a collective weakness that scales easily and spreads quickly. Consider the rulers who believed power confirmed virtue. From Roman emperors who mistook expansion for legitimacy to 20th century leaders who imagined history had chosen them as instruments of destiny, the assumption was always the same: that success proved moral elevation. Yet the fall was equally predictable. Power inflated perception, narrowed judgment, and silenced doubt until reality intervened with consequences no speech could negotiate away. The French Revolution offers a subtler lesson. It began with the language of reason, equality, and human dignity, yet quickly descended into paranoia and mass execution. Those who claimed to act on behalf of humanity became convinced that disagreement itself was proof of corruption. When moral certainty replaces self-questioning, cruelty acquires justification and restraint becomes weakness. History does not record this as an anomaly, but as a recurring phase. At the individual level, the mechanism is the same. The ego does not ask whether a belief is accurate. It asks whether a belief protects status. Once this priority is established, evidence becomes an enemy and humility a threat. Carl Jung warned that the unexamined unconscious does not disappear, but seeks expression through projection, turning internal chaos into external conflict. Modern society amplifies this tendency rather than correcting it. Technology offers constant mirrors, and every mirror invites performance. Opinions are rewarded with attention, outrage is mistaken for insight, and visibility becomes confused with significance. The human animal adapts quickly to these conditions, learning not how to understand more deeply, but how to appear certain more loudly. From a biological perspective, this is unsurprising. The nervous system evolved to secure position within a group, not to arrive at objective truth. Social survival favored confidence over accuracy and dominance over reflection. What we now call arrogance was once an efficient strategy, and efficiency often survives long after its usefulness expires. This is why historical collapses feel familiar rather than shocking. They are not failures of intelligence, but failures of restraint. The same instincts that built civilizations eventually destabilized them when left unchecked. Scale changed, tools improved, language evolved, but the psychological architecture remained stubbornly intact. Understanding this does not absolve responsibility. It removes excuses. Once you see that your impulses are inherited rather than chosen, you lose the luxury of identifying with them. Discipline begins where identification ends, and maturity begins when admiration for one's own reactions quietly fades. One of the most persistent modern illusions is the belief that emotions are reliable indicators of truth. Feelings are treated not as signals to be examined, but as verdicts to be obeyed. To be offended is assumed to mean that an injustice has occurred. To feel discomfort is interpreted as proof of harm. Yet history suggests the opposite. Societies decline not when emotions are suppressed, but when they are crowned as authorities. Ancient Athens offers an early warning. While celebrated as the birthplace of reason and democracy, it ultimately condemned Socrates not because he was wrong, but because he was unsettling. His questions disrupted collective comfort, and emotional unease was mistaken for danger. The city that claimed to value truth chose relief instead, and paid for it with intellectual stagnation that followed political decline. This pattern reappears in different forms. Religious inquisitions framed fear as righteousness and doubt as betrayal. Totalitarian regimes converted collective anxiety into moral certainty, teaching citizens to feel before they thought. In each case, emotional alignment replaced critical distance, and the crowd learned to experience itself as virtuous precisely when it became most destructive. The modern world, despite its language of progress, has refined rather than eliminated this tendency. Emotional expression is encouraged without the accompanying responsibility of interpretation. To feel strongly is treated as evidence of depth, while restraint is viewed with suspicion. The result is not a more humane society, but a louder and more fragile one. Psychologically, this fragility is expensive. When every inner disturbance demands validation, attention collapses inward, and perception narrows. Individuals become preoccupied with managing their emotional image rather than confronting reality. What was once a private fluctuation becomes a public demand, and the capacity for endurance quietly erodes. Philosophers who observed human suffering closely never confused relief with growth. Schopenhauer understood that life oscillates between pain and boredom, and that chasing comfort only sharpens dissatisfaction. The refusal to tolerate discomfort does not eliminate suffering, it multiplies it by removing its meaning. History does not remember the most sensitive generations as the wisest, but as the least resilient. Civilizations endure not because they feel more, but because they regulate more. Emotional discipline, not emotional indulgence, has always been the invisible structure behind lasting order. To recognize this is not to deny feeling, but to dethrone it. Emotions are weather, not climate, signals, not commands. When they govern action unchecked, they reduce complex reality into simple reactions, and complex responsibility into moral performance. The human being who insists on emotional innocence often mistakes vulnerability for virtue and fragility for depth. Yet strength has never been loud, and resilience has never been theatrical. It is quiet, repetitive, and largely invisible, which is why it is so often overlooked by those who mistake expression for substance. As emotional authority replaced restraint, the search for meaning also changed its shape. Meaning was no longer something constructed through responsibility, but something demanded as a right. Modern individuals increasingly ask what life owes them, rather than what structure they are willing to endure in order to carry weight. This shift is subtle, but its consequences are historically familiar. Throughout history, meaning has often been promised most loudly in moments of collapse. When the Roman Republic fractured under internal decay, myths of destiny and greatness intensified. When Europe staggered after war and economic ruin, grand ideological narratives emerged to explain suffering and assign blame. These stories did not appear because they were true, but because uncertainty had become unbearable. Total explanations are seductive precisely because they remove ambiguity. They offer clarity without effort and identity without discipline. Once adopted, they discourage doubt and reward loyalty, gradually replacing thought with belonging. History remembers these moments not for the meaning they provided, but for the devastation that followed when reality resisted simplification. At the individual level, the same temptation operates quietly. The promise of a personal purpose that requires no sacrifice is irresistible. People adopt identities, beliefs, and causes, not because they have examined them deeply, but because these frameworks offer instant coherence. The question of truth becomes secondary to the comfort of orientation. Viktor Frankl observed, through experience rather than theory, that meaning is not discovered by introspection alone, but forged through responsibility. He understood that suffering becomes destructive when it lacks direction, and that discipline is what transforms endurance into dignity. History confirms this repeatedly. Individuals and societies collapse not from pain itself, but from the refusal to assign it purpose. This refusal is often disguised as progress. The rejection of limits is celebrated as liberation, and self-definition is elevated above self-mastery. Yet every civilization that dissolved its internal constraints in the name of freedom eventually learned that freedom without structure is not expansion, but entropy. At this point, the pattern should be difficult to ignore. The human tendency to inflate itself, to sanctify emotion, and to demand meaning without burden has not changed across centuries. Tools evolved, language refined, but the underlying impulse remained intact. The same error repeats, only faster and with better lighting. What emerges from this perspective is not cynicism, but proportion. Human beings are neither worthless nor exalted. They are limited, reactive, and capable of improvement only within constraint. Progress, when it occurs, is slow, unglamorous, and usually invisible while it happens. At some point, every individual encounters a quiet but decisive moment of choice. It is not dramatic, and it rarely announces itself clearly. The choice is between continuing to interpret oneself as a special case or accepting the more demanding position of being a disciplined participant in reality. Most people never notice this moment because it does not feel heroic. It feels like loss. To abandon the belief in personal exceptionality means surrendering a certain emotional comfort. It requires letting go of the idea that one's reactions deserve constant attention, that one's suffering automatically confers depth, or that one's opinions carry weight simply because they are felt sincerely. History shows that cultures stagnate when this surrender is avoided, and individuals decay in quieter but equally predictable ways. The resistance to this surrender is understandable. To see oneself as merely human, rather than secretly extraordinary, feels like a reduction. Yet reduction is often clarification. Astronomy did not diminish humanity by removing the Earth from the center of the universe. It restored scale. In the same way, psychological maturity begins when the self is returned to its proper size. Many historical figures remembered for their discipline rather than their charisma understood this intuitively. Roman Stoics did not deny emotion, but they refused to obey it blindly. Craftsmen, soldiers, and thinkers who endured long before modern comforts did not search for validation. They searched for alignment between action and reality. Their lives were not easier, but they were coherent. Modern life obscures this coherence. Distraction replaces reflection, and identity replaces character. People are encouraged to describe themselves endlessly, yet rarely required to refine themselves. In this environment, The ego thrives while competence erodes, and self-expression expands while self-command weakens. To step out of this pattern is not to reject modernity, but to resist its most corrosive incentives. It means choosing silence over performance when silence is necessary, endurance over explanation when endurance is sufficient, and responsibility over recognition when recognition offers nothing durable. This is the threshold. Beyond it lies no comfort, but clarity. The final section will not offer motivation or reassurance, but a direct confrontation with what remains when excuses, myths, and inherited narratives are stripped away. Now that the scale has been restored and the illusions have been reduced, there is little left to hide behind. No historical myth, no emotional narrative, no borrowed identity can protect you here. What remains is a human organism with limited time, partial awareness, and a responsibility that does not care whether you feel ready for it. You are not here to feel important. Importance is a social hallucination, granted temporarily and revoked without notice. History is filled with individuals who were admired, feared, or celebrated in their moment, and then erased so thoroughly that only specialists remember their names. The universe did not pause for them, and it will not pause for you. This is not a reason for despair, but a correction of posture. When you stop demanding that reality recognize you, you become capable of recognizing reality instead. Attention turns outward, action becomes deliberate, and effort finally detaches from the need for applause. This is the psychological shift most people avoid because it offers no instant reward. You will not be saved by understanding alone. Insight without discipline simply produces a more articulate form of avoidance. Knowing that you are driven by instinct does not free you from it. Only sustained resistance does. The work is repetitive, often boring, and almost never visible to others, which is precisely why it has value. History does not admire those who felt deeply or spoke passionately. It remembers those who endured structure longer than others were willing to. Civilizations were built not by people who believed in their own specialness, but by people who accepted limitation and organized their behavior accordingly. The same principle applies at the individual level, without exception. If this feels uncomfortable, that is not a flaw in the message. Discomfort is the correct response when illusions collapse. The mistake is to interpret that discomfort as harm rather than orientation. Pain that clarifies is not cruelty, it is instruction. You are a temporary configuration of matter, driven by inherited impulses, surrounded by forces you do not control, and judged not by intention but by outcome. This does not make you meaningless. It makes your choices heavier, because they are not protected by destiny or significance. Lower your self-image until it fits reality, then build upward, slowly, through discipline rather than fantasy. Carry what you can carry. Remove what you cannot justify. Stop asking who you are and start deciding what you are willing to sustain. You do not need to be special. You need to be precise. You need to be restrained. You need to be accountable. Everything else is noise.